welcome to this week's review, which looks at the Burson Funk. This is a small form factor integrated amplifier with a built-in headphone amplifier as a bit of a bonus. Now, of course, I'll be reviewing the amplifier, but one of the highlights of the design is that you can roll your own op amps. That is, you can replace the old op amps, the default op amps, and you can put new ones, upgraded op amps in there to hopefully enhance the sound quality. Now, when Burson released the Funk integrated amp with built-in headphone amp, they also released, as a separate thing, something called a supercharger. Now, I'll put a little link to a hi-fi news video I did recently, which looked a little bit more detail at the supercharger. Now, the supercharger can be used to upgrade power supplies in and around other Burson equipment, but I thought I would review the supercharger with the Funk just to see if it helped the sound quality at all. So this is a bit of a two-in-one review, I would say. Now, before we get any more techie about this whole kit and caboodle, I think we need to take a closer look. And welcome to the closer look section of the Burson Funk Firm amplifier with built-in headphone amp. That's what I'm going to call it, and that's what I'm going to stick with. Now, whichever way you want it, this Class A/B device measures just 190 millimeters by 150 by 60 millimeters and hits around 3 kilograms in weight. The size is small because the normally large fitted capacitors have been replaced by the company's condensed max current power supply technology. That also means no large and heavy transformers either. During use, the Funk can be run in two orientations. You can run it horizontally as normal, or the Funk can be operated in a vertical position if mounted in Burson's so-called cool stand. This extra was not included in my review package, so my comments on that accessory end right about here. As an aside though, the Funk's own chassis also acts as a heatsink. Let's spin this little box to the rear now, and the rear of the chassis features a set of speaker connectors, a pair of RCA inputs, and the power connector for the switch mode power supply. Moving to the front again, and we'll find a 6.3mm and 3.5mm headphone socket. For the price, I was hoping, maybe not expecting, but certainly hoping for a Pentacon connection, but there's none here. You do get a volume knob though, and a button to flip between speakers and headphone use, a gain switch for IEMs and over-the-ear headphones, and a power button. One of the main features of the Funk is the ability to roll your own op amps. That is, you are encouraged to actually open up the chassis case, and there's a hex key supplied to allow you to do that. You can then replace the standard default op amps with improved models supplied by Burson, and you'll need to spend out some extra cash to buy those other op amps. We'll talk more about this feature a bit later on. You also get a nifty little external converter plug that allows you to plug in two 3.5mm headphones into one socket. It's a little breakout converter socket plug. Hence, you are able to have cozy listening sessions with your friend or partner. Oh, and before I forget, let's nip around to the rear again. There's a microphone socket, so you can use the Funk as a desktop device for gaming activities. My question is this: why wasn't this extra added to the front of the chassis? Surely that would be the natural position for gaming instead of having to hunt around the rear of the chassis for the socket on a typical desk. So that's the Funk and all of the sockets and the switches. But how does this thing actually sound? Well, Let's get to the sound quality tests and we will find out. To begin, I decided to tackle the headphone amplifier side of things in both 6.35 and 3.5mm terms, and played Ella Fitzgerald's Brighten the Corner and the track I Shall Not Be Moved, which is covered with close harmony backing, percussion, upright bass, cymbal taps and piano. I began with the 6.35mm single-ended mode and my Sennheiser HD 800s, which the Funk drove very well. The 800s can be, well, a bit of a pig to actually push around. They need a bit of a shove to get going, but the Funk did a good job here. Now, the last time I heard a Burson product of any sort, it was a DAC, I think. I'll put a link below for that particular review of that particular DAC, which is on my website. I remember listening to this particular DAC, and I put a name of the DAC. I can't remember the name of the DAC now. What was it called? I'll put the name underneath here, you can see. And as I say, there's a link below. And anyway, I was a bit disturbed by the rather edgy output from that box. Now, the difference in sound from this Funk could not have been more different. What hit me principally was the amount of air and space around the soundstage. The latter sounded large indeed. Swilling in atmosphere it was. Yes, the upper mids were slightly, and I mean, ever so slightly pushed towards the outer limits, but nothing too aggressive and certainly nothing to cause offence. There was just a slight movement in that direction. If anything, that aided the overall focus of the large amount of detail on offer here. The large soundstage space, which pushed left and right to occupy as much area as possible, allowed that detail to flow easily, which meant that the rather shy and subtle information in and around the mix could more easily be targeted by the ear. Vocals, whether you're talking Fitzgerald's lead or the close harmony backing variants, were both focused in their presentation, but also, well, rather insightful in terms of the amount of information they offered. It was easy to pick out individual voices from that harmony addition. The upright bass was rather focused and quite hefty, adding a real presence to the mix that added both a foundation for the song itself, but also a sense of forward motion, and that kept the tempo snappy and lively. That was the right channel. On the left channel, the piano danced and plonked with a gay abandon in its upper mid areas, but also gave weight during its bass-like moments with a real resonance. In fact, it was this piano grammar that emphasized an almost honky-tonk element to this relatively fast-paced spiritual. The treble from the later cymbal taps wallowed in all of that sound stage space, which meant that cymbals were allowed to reach out and stretch their arms. You felt that you were getting good value from the cymbals via the Funk. The fragility and delicacy was here in full. You never felt shortchanged in this department. The same performance output was provided by the 3.5mm output via my Sennheiser 660S headphones. Now, I had to reduce the gain on these phones because they were easier to run than my 800s. The 660Ss were leaner in terms of their own inherent personality. Even so, the Funk headphone amp gave these headphones full support. You never felt that the Funk was holding the 660Ss back or even cramping their style. Upper, mid and treble performance overall was open and relatively smooth, while bass was disciplined and precise. I then switched the gain option on the front of the chassis in low mode and had a brief listen via my Meze 99 earphones, which worked rather well, reducing the volume enough to be comfortable, but offering power in reserve if required. Again, the performance maintained a relative consistency, providing a generally balanced output, albeit with a slight upper mid-range movement I mentioned earlier. The overall performance was good indeed. I'd be very happy to spend several hours listening to music with this headphone amp. But what if you wanted to use the Funk as a near field integrated amplifier, say on a desk? Say you had a desktop computer and you wanted to install a little hi-fi system around your computer with your little Funk amplifier and a nice pair of desktop speakers, for example. How would the Funk act in that little compact, close to the face, close to the ears scenario? Well, in this setup, I didn't want speakers that were too bulky, yet I wanted quality in overall sound. So I reached for my reference Q Acoustic 3020i models and I hooked them to the Burson using a set of tellurium blue cables and played Bob Marley's Jamming. It was plain in the first few seconds of playback that there was more than enough power within the Funk to do the job in that near field mode. I was hitting the gain around the 1 o'clock area and the volume was, to my ears, loud. I wouldn't want to go much higher than that. So don't be concerned about power in near field mode. It's not an issue. In sonic terms, imagery was very good indeed. Unlike some systems that are targeted towards near field use, the stereo image wasn't nailed on either. The overall effect was more organic, sort of looser, but there was a discipline in terms of instrumental positioning. Hence the soundstage had height and depth. I wouldn't call the stereo image particularly 3D-like in its effect, but there was a sense of depth. The soundstage did stretch left and right as well, adding further dimension to the music. Overall, the Funk had a definite plan of action. Again, moving to Bob Marley's punky reggae party, I was surprised how balanced the output really was in near field mode. Bass offered real presence as well in a similar way to the headphone output. That is, it didn't dominate or veil upper mid-range detail. There was no booming around the lower end, but bass certainly offered a strength and a heft. You certainly knew bass was a member of the team, put it that way. Because of the discipline, both the mid-range and treble still had room to breathe, adding filigree detail when required to strengthen that sense of balance, but also to add accuracy and presentation. Now, what impressed me most was the instrumental separation. It's not very often when I hear the rhythm guitar and keys separated and isolated enough to give them their own spotlights. But the Funk made that happen. What impressed me even more, though, was the Funk's ability in near field mode to describe details for each and every instrument across the soundstage without moving over the line into any sort of clinical brightness. Detail was slightly embossed, shall we say, just enough for the ear to catch each and every element across the soundstage. It was a rather impressive effect. So let's get to the supercharger power supply, shall we? That upgraded little power supply I mentioned earlier on. Now, the supercharger exists to upgrade default bundled power supplies. You buy the supercharger as a separate item and then you add that to your current system to hopefully enhance the sound. And I thought it was an ideal opportunity to try it out here. And well, my goodness, I'm glad I did. The noise floor across the soundstage dropped to reveal a host of new detail, while mid-range insight climbed through the roof. Now, playing Bob Marley's rather iconic song, I Shot at the Sheriff, suddenly the Funk sounded more expensive. I suppose it was actually, because you are paying an extra £285. But there was a real sonic change here. The music had a multi-layered, rich aspect that moved the entire performance up a rung in the sonic ladder. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, you do have the opportunity to roll your own op amps in the funk. That is, you can replace the pair of replaceable op amps that sit on the internally fitted circuit board in the chassis to change and modify the sound to your taste. Now, this means opening up the chassis. Of course, make sure you disconnect the power supply first, and I would wait a little bit to allow for electrical discharge before you dive in there. At this point, well, it reminds me why I dislike Burson's manuals so much. They are truly a poor afterthought, obviously written by, well, that guy who fixed the leak in the roof last Friday. Remember him? Look, whoever it was, presenting their manuals in such a way actually, in my opinion, harms the company. So what to do? How do you go about upgrading the op amps? Grab yourself a screw storage container and your free hex key that arrives in the Funk's box. To open up the chassis, Burson says in its manual that, and I quote, the case can be opened by removing 4 hex screws at the bottom of the case. Now, I don't even know what that means. In fact, this is what you do. On the front and on the rear of the chassis, you will find 4 hex screws, 8 in all. Imagine you're looking straight towards the front of the chassis, unscrew and store safely the top 2 hex screws, upper left and upper right. Then rotate the chassis around and stir straight at the rear of that chassis. Again, remove the top 2 screws from the rear. Again, upper left and upper right. And store the screws in that little storage container I asked you to get at the beginning of this little operation. Then pull the upper part of the case away from the bottom part. The 2 should separate easily without any force involved. It's possible the 2 halves may stick a little bit if they've never been opened before, but just add a little bit of pressure and both parts should separate without too much problem. Also note the size of the screws themselves. The front 2 have a larger screw head than the rear. So tell me, just tell me this, how does all of that equate to, and I quote again, the case can be opened by removing 4 hex screws at the bottom of the case. Anyway, you can now peer inside the chassis to find the op amps that you're looking for, and I'm glad I did actually, because in my case there were 2 large red V6 Vivid dual op amps already installed on the board, and that's when I had my haha moment. My review sample was supplied to me directly from Burson. The V6 Vivid dual op amps are not the default out-of-the-box op amps. They are actually upgrade op amps. They are op amps you would buy separately and then you would install into the Funk, and you would take out the default op amps, you would put them somewhere safe, and you'd have your brand new Vivid V6s in there. Now, the much smaller, less visually impressive JRC 5532D op amps are the default models. That's what I really should have seen in there. That's what I should have been listening to all this time. In addition to that, sitting in another plastic box, I also received another set of upgrade amps. These are sort of yellowy orange V6 Classic dual op amps, which are the same size as the Vivid V6s. The duals are sort of orangey yellow. Now, as I say, I expected to receive the default op amps ready fitted in the Funk, and that's what I should have been reviewing and listening to all along, but I wasn't. I had no idea that the Vivid V6s would be featured in the chassis. I wasn't informed, and it was a good job that I opened up the chassis and didn't just review the Funk as is. Otherwise, my findings would have been skewed and, well, incorrect. So then, all of the sound tests that I've given you thus far should really be read in reverse, because all of my sonic findings thus far are based on the most expensive upgrade op amps that you can buy from Burson, the Vivid V6s. Now, we'll get to the default models in a second, and we'll have a listen to those, and we'll also listen to those yellowy, orangey dual op amps as well, just to see what they sound like. Now, fitting the op amps is pretty straightforward if you know how. Problem is, the Burson manual only grudgingly provides help, but not everything you need. Again, I quote, "The notch at the top of the op amp indicates the orientation of the op amp within the socket, matches to the existing op amp. An accompanying image is included in the manual, which is a good thing, but it could be clearer and more exacting." Now, I'm not sure what the top reference means here, and you're not shown what this notch that they mention actually looks like. So you end up doing some heavy-duty assuming. There is a slight indentation running the length of the V6 op amps, and I assume that needs to be fitted into the socket aligned with the other notch in the socket itself. So the notch on the op amp meets the notch in the socket, and they're orientated in the same direction. Now, the standard 5532D op amps, both of these chips had to be fitted to socket adapters before they could be placed on the board itself. I added the 5532Ds. These are the default models. This is what you'll find in the Funk when you buy the Funk on its own. And that seemed to be a bit of a retrograde step, at least that's how it felt in sonic terms. The 5532Ds looked small, weedy, and slightly inferior. In use, the 5532Ds are, well, they're not bad, but they are indeed inferior sonically to both of the supplied op-amp upgrades. There is a slight ringing in the mid-range, adding a high-frequency noise that adds an edge and a clinical haze over the upper mids. In the Marley song, jamming the plucked high strings on the rhythm guitars, they tended to stab their output into the ear, which wasn't particularly pleasant. Bass was slightly tense, vocals lacked emotion, and so on. These chips, I repeat, are not intrinsically bad, especially when heard in isolation. They just fail when compared directly with the other Vivid upgrade chips. As for the classic duals, that's the yellowy orange op amps, well, they're a sort of halfway house between the default op amps and those red V6 Vivids I mentioned earlier. The duals reduce the noise floor, open up the soundstage, improve detail, but never goes far or sound quite as mature as the Vivids. For me, those red V6 Vivid op amps were the pick of the bunch. In fact, to be honest, I wouldn't buy a Burson Funk without them fitted and ready to go. That is, I would buy both the Funk itself and the upgrade right there and then, from the shelf. I wouldn't do any upgrades. I'd ask them to be fitted by your dealer right there and then during your purchase. Hence, I don't see the Funk as a £599 product at all. I see the Funk and a V6 Vivid op amp selection as the required default, with a supercharger upgrade to follow as soon as your funds will allow. Even so, the entire operation was a fascinating one. It's a whole new area for upgrading and tweaking for any hi-fi enthusiast. Now, I realise that some users out there will recoil in horror at the thought of opening up an amplifier chassis and fishing around inside. But really, Burson make it pretty easy for you, manual aside, but hey, I'm always here to help if you get into any difficulty. Now, I would advise you to have a go. Take it easy, one step at a time, and you'll wonder what all the fuss was about. So, after all of that, how should I conclude the review for the Burson Funk integrated amplifier with an added headphone amp included? Well, I was ready to dislike the Funk from Burson because of my past experience with other company products, that DAC I mentioned specifically. But I was surprised indeed at how much I actually enjoyed my time with the Funk in its upgraded mode, at least. The default op amps are, well, to me, disappointing in sonic terms and should be changed immediately. Apart from the terrible manual, and it is a terrible manual, the design of the amplifier itself is solid, well made, compact, flexible, upgradable, and well appointed with plenty of features to hand. As for the sound, well, based upon the preferred V6 Vivid dual op amps, that's pretty well balanced and almost neutral, giving a sonically spacious headphone experience, while the near field performance is quite superb. All computer desk-bound users, and even those looking to install a small system in a bedroom or a conservatory or a kitchen or similar, should give this one serious consideration. As a piece of hi-fi equipment, the Funk provides excellent value for money. At a time when fuel prices around the world are rocketing, well, I've just had a quiet word with my gas provider and the results, well, they were not pretty, put it that way. Food prices are also on the up, transport costs are rising, and more. Value for money hi-fi, well, that's becoming increasingly important. In fact, value will be a headline feature in the coming year or two. I'm sure on that basis, Burson has certainly blended buckets of value in and around the Funk and merged that with a welcome slice of quality to produce a surefire winner. And that's all, folks. Thank you very much for staying to the end of this video, and thank you for your support, and thank you for all those likes and subscribes as well. If you haven't, could I ask you possibly down there somewhere if you could click on the like and subscribe button? Check out also the description, which has those links, those review links I mentioned earlier on. There's also a selection of chapter headings, which you can click and navigate around this video. You can have a look at that down there. My social media links are down there too. That includes the link to my Facebook group, and you're welcome to join that if you like. I have a link to my website where there's a host of editorial you will not see on this channel. And can I ask you to at least consider supporting me via Patreon? This channel only really exists because of Patreon and the canned support I receive from my patrons from there. It literally keeps this channel going. So please check out that page. There's a link below, and there's exclusive material on there as a sort of thank you for actually helping me out. Now, I will be back next Tuesday with Tuneful Tuesday, which oddly enough happens on a Tuesday. And I think we're going to go for a music magazine, so expect some vinyl news and some book reviews, and I think some CD reviews. That'll be next Tuesday. So I hope to see you then. Until that time, guys. Until that time, bye-bye for now.